Happy Friday, beer runners, and welcome to another edition of the iRunOnBeer Friday 5. If this is your first time tuning into the Friday 5, basically this is my weekly YouTube series where I go through a list of 5 things pertaining to a particular theme, idea, or topic. I've done a bunch of episodes in the past you can go back and watch, but this week I'm going to be focusing on one thing in particular, and that is the podcast that I like to listen to when I'm running. You may have seen my previous episode where I talked about 5 songs that I love to listen to on race day, but when I'm not racing, I almost never listen to music when I'm running. I'm always listening to podcasts. At any time, I'd probably say I have around 12 to 15 podcasts that I'm actively trying to keep up with, sometimes more. I actually haven't counted in a while, and I seem to keep adding them as time goes on. It can be daunting to try to get all of those podcasts in, especially when you have some that are releasing multiple episodes a week. So I definitely appreciate those longer training runs and sometimes that long commute to work, so I have plenty of time to knock those out. I also have a tip or trick if you are unfamiliar or haven't tried podcasts or a little unsure if you have the time to listen to them. What I do, I'm not sure what app you use. I use Podcast Addict on Android, but that lets me speed up the pace at which the podcast plays, and I listen to all of my podcasts at 2 times speed. That can seem a little crazy. I know my wife gives me a hard time constantly when she hears me listening to podcasts because she can't understand anything that anyone is saying. But if you do it incrementally, you kind of get used to listening to things at that speed. So at least on this app, I can increase the speed by 1/10 of a point each time, and I just slowly work my way up from normal speed to 2 times speed. So if you're having trouble keeping track of all your podcasts or just fitting them all in time, try that because it cuts the time you need in half. So definitely a great tip. So before we jump into my 5 favorite podcasts to listen to while I'm running, I have to give a couple of quick shout outs. First and foremost, Aftershokz headphones. You've heard me talk about them a bunch before. You may have seen my in-depth review that I did on the Trex Air, this particular pair of Aftershokz, but I love these headphones. I literally wear them on just about every single run. Training runs, when I'm racing, I wear them around the house just if I'm cleaning or anything like that. I love not having to deal with wires, and I also love being able to listen to what I want to listen to while also still hearing what's going on around me. So quick plug for Aftershokz, definitely check them out if you've never heard of them, and check out my review as well. Second shout out, or an honorable mention, I will say, is a podcast that I just recently started listening to, so it didn't make the list of my top 5 for this week, but that's the Beer Runner podcast. I think obviously you could see why I would be drawn to that podcast. It matches my interests to a T, but I've been a follower of the Beer Runner for a long time. Loved all of his writing for Draft Magazine, love following him on Twitter, and happy to see that he's launching a podcast. So he's only 1 episode in plus an intro podcast, so if you're new to podcasts or looking for something where there's not a lot of content to catch up on, would highly recommend. It's got great interviews so far. The interview he did was incredible about one of the beer mile world record holders, and looking forward to everything else that's going to come out from him. So stay tuned for more content from the Beer Runner. Jumping right into this week's topic, the 5 favorite podcasts I have that I listen to on my training runs, and number 1 has to go to You Made It Weird with Pete Holmes. I'm a huge fan of Pete Holmes. I love his stand-up comedy. I love his podcast, and I loved his show on HBO, Crashing While It Lasted. Unfortunately, it was just recently canceled after the 3rd season, but it was great while it lasted. But I'm a huge fan of his. I really love his podcast. You may notice a theme among a lot of my favorite podcasts. I do tend to prefer that long-form interview style podcast. I just think it's great to kind of delve really deep into a topic and helps you just kind of zone out of your run and just focus on whatever topic is being discussed. I love You Made It Weird in particular because since he is a comedian, he usually keeps the conversation pretty light, but he has a pretty interesting background or a pretty interesting perspective on things that allows him to dive pretty deep into some serious topics while, like I said, just keeping the overall feel of the conversation light. So huge fan of his, would highly recommend. He's towards the top of my list only because I do have so many podcasts to get through that his is one of the ones where I tend to only listen to it if it's a particular person that I'm interested in or I've heard of, and sometimes will occasionally skip one if I just don't simply have the time. But even if he is interviewing someone who I have no idea who it is, if I have the time, I'll always listen just because, like I said, he's a great interviewer, brings a really cool perspective to the conversations, and it's definitely develops these really interesting conversations that help, like I said, just separate you from the run, and just kind of help you zone out, reach that flow state, and just focus on whatever conversation is being had. Coming in at number 2 is the Training for Ultra podcast. I told you not all the podcasts on the list are necessarily running related. This is actually one of only 2 that I chose that were specifically focused on running, but couldn't have this list without putting Training for Ultra up there. He's a phenomenal podcaster, great guy to follow on Instagram, any kind of social media, incredibly motivational, and his podcast, again, is one of those interview style podcasts podcast where he's usually interviewing a broad range of athletes from the ultra running scene. So would highly recommend, especially if you are at all interested in ultra marathon running. What I really like about his podcast in particular is that he is, or describes himself as a middle of the pack crusher. He is not by any means an elite runner. He's not racing for wins at any of the races that he's signing up for, but just has a true passion and love for the sport, is a great ambassador for running and ultra running in particular, and really does his best to get more people involved in the sport. Again, because of his background, he got into running for health reasons, discovered it at a later age, and has really just dove in head first, and is really cool to hear or follow along with his podcast and follow along with his journey as he continues to really rise to the top of the middle of the pack, as he would like to say. But a really great podcast, great listen, a lot of really inspirational people on there, so would highly recommend. He has really taken off, I think, since he ran the Moab 240 last year, and this year his big goal is to run the Triple Crown of 200-mile races later in the fall. So, like I said, has a really cool journey, has really dove in head first to the sport of running, and is a lot of fun to follow along as he progresses through these various challenges that he sets up for himself. So, great interviewer and also just an inspirational journey to follow along with. Would highly recommend Training for Ultra as my number 2 podcast that I love to listen to on the run. Moving right along to number 3, of course, I would be remiss if I did not give a special shout out to the Bib Brave podcast. Obviously, I am a huge fan of Bib Brave as a company. I'm one of the ambassadors for their Bib Brave Pro program, and apart from all the other incredible opportunities and things like that they offer runners, they do have a phenomenal podcast. One of my favorite things about the podcast in particular is that it comes out every Friday, which is great timing for runners, just in time for that weekend long run, and they give you some great topics and content to listen to on those weekend long runs. So if you're unfamiliar with the Bib Brave podcast, it's really split into kind of 2 parts. The podcast is hosted by a couple of the founders of Bib Brave, and what's really nice is you spend the first half of the podcast getting to hear just kind of life updates, training updates, goal updates, things like that from the team, so you get to follow along with their specific journey, which is something that I enjoy. And then the second half of the podcast is diving into a specific hot topic around the sport of running, where they find a particular expert in whatever the topic may be for that week, and then have an interview style podcast where they just, like I said, try to dive deep into that hot topic and give you as much useful information as they can. They cover a broad range of topics. They always have incredible interviewees on the podcast. So like I said, just a great thing to listen to on those weekend long runs, a great way to make sure that you're staying up to date on all news and any kind of updates or particular hot topics or fads that may be affecting the sport, and also a fun way just to keep up to date with the Bib Brave team. So if you haven't checked it out, had to give a special shout out to the Bib Brave podcast, would highly recommend giving it a listen. Coming in at number 4 is one of my all-time favorite podcasts. It's another comedy-focused podcast, and actually a podcast that I have seen live recorded at least 10 or 15 times by now. He comes to New York City a lot to record the podcast, and anytime he does, I always try to get in for the show, and that is the Doug Loves Movies podcast. If you are unfamiliar, this is a show hosted by comedian Doug Benson. He's a hilarious stand-up comedian, but also just has an insane depth of knowledge of movie trivia. Some might say useless movie trivia, but he's definitely been able to use it to his advantage pretty well. But basically, Doug Benson hosts. He has a panel of comedians that change every time he does an episode based on whatever city he's in. Usually he tries to get a lot of local comedians to come in and help record the episode. But the first half of the podcast is just a lot of improv and banter, which I find extremely hilarious. I actually almost didn't put this on my list because it has gotten so funny recently that sometimes I have trouble listening to it on the run because I start laughing so hard that I can't control my breathing and I have to slow down to catch my breath so that I can start running again. But I'm a huge fan of the podcast. Like I said, that first kind of just back and forth between the comedians is always hysterical. And then for the second portion of the show, it moves into the trivia. There's a series of insane games that he plays. And what I really like about listening to this podcast in particular, and why I did decide to still include it on my list, is that the trivia is another great way to just kind of take your mind off of the run, especially if you might be struggling, and just focus on a completely different topic that requires a lot of thought. So I love playing along with the movie trivia. One of my favorite games that he plays every week or every episode is the Last Man Standing game, where basically they get a suggestion from the audience of a particular actor or actress, and they take turns naming a movie that person has starred in, and whoever is the last man standing is the winner. So that's fun to play along with. I just start running through the person's name and trying to come up with as many movies as I can, and see if I can continue to come up with them before they run out. I usually never can. Like I said, it's insane how much a lot of these people know about movies, but just a really fun podcast, great for a good laugh, sometimes too much of a laugh while you're running, but then also great trivia to kind of remove you or keep your mind off of the running at hand. So one of my all-time favorite podcasts, especially to listen to while I'm running. Last but certainly not least is actually the podcast that made me start listening to all of my podcasts at 2x speed just to manage the sheer amount of content that he has coming out every week, and that's Joe Rogan and the Joe Rogan Experience. I'm a huge fan of this podcast. Like I said early on, you'll notice a theme as far as my preferences for podcasts tend to focus around people who are doing long-form interviews. I wouldn't really even necessarily consider what Joe Rogan's podcast is as an interview. I would consider it more of just a long-form conversation. Basically, on his podcast, he just finds people that he's interested in talking to or that he finds interesting and has 2, 3, 4 hour conversations with them live on air. I like that it's live because there's no editing, no preparation necessarily or things like that. It's just two people having a conversation or sometimes more on air, and he covers some really cool topics. It could be anywhere as advanced as discussing the specifics of quantum physics. Believe me, that was an episode that I found my brain kind of melting during while I was trying to listen and run and focus on the specifics of quantum physics. Or it could be something as inane as a couple of his friends live on air just getting obliterated, trashed, and seeing what happens on the podcast. So you can never really be sure what's going to happen, but it's always going to be either fun, interesting, intriguing conversation. And like I said, there's always plenty of content, so if I'm running low on podcasts or anything like that, I've always got at least 1 or 2 Joe Rogan episodes saved up ready for any training run. Another thing that I really appreciate about his podcast in particular is because he's interviewing or talking to people that he's interested in, he has a strong infatuation or interest in endurance athletes or people just pushing their bodies beyond the limit. So he's done an episode with Courtney Dauwalter after she crushed the Moab 240. He interviewed the guy who swam all the way around the island of the United Kingdom. He interviewed the guy who ran all the way across Antarctica. He interviewed Eddie Izzard after all of his marathon attempts and the crazy challenges that he's done. So if you're looking for a cool, interesting podcast, but also one that's guaranteed to have some truly inspirational episodes, I would highly recommend the Joe Rogan Experience. It's easily number 1 on my list of my favorite podcasts to listen to while I'm running. There you have it. Those are my 5 favorite podcasts to listen to while I'm on a run. If I miss your favorites, please let me know in the comments down below. I am always looking for new content and new topics to follow, new podcasts, so please let me know some of your favorites. Let's get a discussion going and try to get a long list so that people have plenty of options to choose from, especially people who might be new to listening to podcasts who are looking for plenty of new podcasts to subscribe to. If you are not necessarily a podcast person, you can go back a few weeks. I have an episode where I also go over my 5 favorite songs that I like to listen to on race day. On race day, I put the podcast aside and I'm looking for much more of that kind of energy boost, that motivation I need to get through the struggle, especially towards the end of a race. So you can go back and check that out. If you're new to the channel, I hope you'll subscribe so that we see you around here in the future. And please, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like. That'll just help others find the video as well in the future. So, as always, congratulations on making it through another week. Happy Friday. I hope you enjoy the weekend, and I guess that's all I have to say. Cheers.